Just go away. Leave me alone.
My lord was quite insistent about certain rights and duties on the night of his return to Val Alorn. Not even the locked door of my bedchamber was enough to curb his insistence.
All right, Beric said, flushing slightly. I am sorry about that. I had hoped that things had changed between us. I was wrong. I won't bother you again.
Bother, my lord? A duty is not a bother. A good wife is obliged to submit whenever her husband requires it of her, no matter how drunk or brutal he may be when he comes to her bed. No one will ever be able to accuse me of laxity in that regard.
You're enjoying this, aren't you?
Enjoying what, my lord? Her voice was light, but with a cutting edge to it.
What do you want, Merrill?
I want to serve my lord in his illness. I want to care for him. I watch the progress of his disease, each symptom as it appears.
Do you hate me that much?
Beric asked with heavy contempt.
Be careful, Merrill. I might take it into my head to insist that you stay with me. How would you like that? How would you like to be locked in this room with a raging beast?
If you grow unmanageable, my lord, I can always have you chained to the wall, she suggested, meeting his enraged glare with cool unconcern. Private. And now it was gone. He felt vaguely empty and somehow violated. He sighed and went up the broad stairway toward his room. There were a half-dozen warriors in the hallway outside his room, probably part of Beric's search for the man in the green cloak. Geryon stopped. Something was wrong, and he shook off his half-daze. This part of the palace was much too populated to make it very likely that the spy would be hiding here. His heart began racing, and step by step he began to back away toward the top of the stairs he had just climbed. The warriors looked like any other Characs in the palace, bearded, dressed in helmets, mail shirts, and furs. But something didn't seem exactly right. A bulky man in a dark, hooded cloak stepped through the doorway of Geryon's room into the corridor. It was Asherak. The Murgo was about to say something, but then his eyes fell on Geryon. "Ah," he said softly. His dark eyes gleamed in his scarred face. "I have been looking for you, Geryon," he said in that same soft voice. "Come here, boy." Geryon felt a tentative tug at his mind that seemed to slip away, as if it somehow could not get a sure grip. He shook his head mutely and continued to back away. "Come along now," Asherak said. "We have known each other far too long for this. Do as I say. You know that you must." The tug became a power. "Maybe I'm not, but I think you'll have to catch me first." Asherak turned quickly to his warriors. "That's the boy I want. Take him." Smoothly, almost as if it were done without thought, one of the warriors raised his bow and leveled an arrow directly at Geryon. Asherak swung his arm quickly and knocked the bow aside, just as the steel-pointed shaft was loosed. The arrow sang in the air and clattered against the stones of the wall a few feet to Geryon's left. "Alive, idiot!" Asherak snarled, and struck the bowman a crushing blow to the side of the head. The bowman fell, twitching to the stone floor. Geryon spun, dashed back to the stairs, and plunged down, 3 steps at a time. He did not bother to look back. The sound of heavy feet told him that Asherak and his men were after him. At the bottom of the stairs, he turned sharply to the left and fled down a long, dark passageway that led back into the maze of Anheg's palace. Chapter 18. There were warriors everywhere, and the sounds of fighting. In the first instant of his flight, Gerion's plan had been simple. All he had to do was to find some of Barak's warriors, and he would be safe. But there were other warriors in the palace as well. The Earl of Yarvik had led a small army into the palace by way of the ruined wings to the south, and fighting raged in the corridors. Gerion quickly realized that there was no way he could distinguish friend from enemy. To him, one Carrick warrior looked the same as another. Unless he could find Barak or someone else he recognized, he did not dare reveal himself to any of them. The frustrating knowledge that he was running from his friends as well as his enemies added to his fright. It was altogether possible, even quite likely, that he would run from Barak's men directly into the arms of Jarvix. The most logical thing to do would be to go directly back to the council hall, but in his haste to escape from Asherak, he had run down so many dim passageways and turned so many corners that he had no idea where he was or how to get back to the familiar parts of the palace. His headlong flight was dangerous. Asherak or his men could wait around any corner to seize him, and he knew that the Murgo could quickly re-establish that strange bond between them that Aunt Paul had shattered with her touch. It was that which had to be avoided at any cost. Once Asherak had him again, he would never let go. The only alternative to him was to find some place to hide. He dodged into another narrow passageway and stopped, panting, and with his back time before. But it somehow seemed it wasn't enough. For some reason, I felt I needed more.
It is the nature of Engerak gold, Mr. Wolf said. It calls to its own. The more one has, the more it comes to possess him. That's why Murgos are so lavish with it. Asherak was not buying your services, Yarvik. He was buying your soul. Yarvik nodded, his face gloomy. At any rate, it wasn't long before I found an excuse to sail to Darain again. Asherak told me that since Murgos are forbidden to enter Carrick, he had developed a great curiosity about us and our kingdom. He asked me many questions, and he gave me gold for every answer. It seemed to me to be a foolish way to spend money. But I gave him the answers and took his gold. Then I came back to Carrick. I had another pouch full. I went to Jarvik's home and put the new gold with what I already had. I saw that I was a rich man, and I still had not done anything dishonorable. But now it seemed that there wasn't enough hours in the day. I spent all of the time locked in my strong room, counting my gold, over and over, polishing it until it gleamed red as blood, and filling my ears with the sound of its tinkling. But after a while, it seemed I didn't really have very much. And so I went back to Asherak. He said he was still curious about Carrick, and that he'd like to know Anheg's mind. He told me that he would give me as much gold as I already had if I sent him word of what he has said in the high councils here in the palace for a year. At first I said no, because I knew it would be dishonorable. But then he showed me the gold, and I could not say no anymore. From where he watched, Gerion could see the expressions of those in the hall below. Their faces had a curious mingling of pity and contempt as Jarvik's story continued. It was then, and heck.
This ends at Disc 9. Please change to Disc 10.
My queen is far too precious for me to allow her to take such a terrible risk.
I must accede to the will of my lord, Elena said in a relieved tone. By his command, I withdraw my suggestion.
The courage of my queen honors me, Enheg said, with an absolutely straight face.
Elena bowed and backed away rather quickly. Aunt Paul looked at Mr. Wolf with one raised eyebrow, but let it pass. Wolf's expression became more serious as he rose from the chair in which he had been sitting.
I think that the time has come to make some decisions. Things are beginning to move too fast, or any more delay.
He looked at Anheg.
Is there some place where we can speak without risk of being overheard? There's a chamber in one of the towers. I thought about it.
Whatever my lord commands, she replied, with a tilt of her hands that spoke whole volumes of sarcasm. With Hetar's help, King Kohag managed the stairs, although his progress was painfully slow.
I apologize for this,
he puffed, stopping halfway up to catch his breath.
It's as tiresome for me as it is for you.
King Anheg posted guards at the foot of the stairs, then came up and closed the heavy door behind him.
Light the fire, cousin,
he said to Beric.
We might as well be comfortable.
Beric nodded and put a torch to the wood in the fireplace. The chamber was round and not too spacious, but there was adequate room for them all, and chairs and benches to sit on. Mr. Wolf stood at one of the windows, looking down at the twinkling lights of Val Alorn below.
I have always been fond of towers,
he said, almost to himself.
To help you, Belgarath.
Mr. Wolf thought for a moment. Suddenly he grinned.
I am certain that our thief is listening very hard, waiting for one of us to speak his name, or the name of the thing he stole. Sooner or later, someone is bound to make a slip, and once he locates us, he will be able to hear every word we say. Instead of trying to gag ourselves, I think it might be better if we gave him something to listen to. If you can arrange it. I'd like to have every minstrel and storyteller in the North start retelling certain old stories. You know the ones. When the names start sounding in every village marketplace north of the Kamar River, it will set up a roaring in his ears like a thunderstorm. If nothing else, it will give us freedom to speak. In time, he will get tired of it and stop listening.
It's getting late, Father, Aunt Paul reminded him.
Wolf nodded. We are playing a deadly game, he told them all. But our enemies are playing one just as deadly. Their danger is as great as ours. And right now, no one can predict what will finally happen. Make your preparations and send out men you can trust to keep watch. Be patient. Don't do anything rash. That could be more dangerous than anything else right now. At the moment, Bulgar and I are the only ones who can act. You are going to have to trust us. I know that sometimes some of the things we have done have seemed a bit strange, but there are reasons for what we do. Please, do not interfere again. I will get word to you now and then about our progress. If I need you to do anything else, I'll let you know. All right?
The kings nodded gravely, and everyone rose to their feet. Anheg stepped over to Mr. Wolf.
Could you come to my study in an hour or so, Belgarath? I'd like to have a few words with you and Pilgara before your departure. If you wish, Anheg.
Come along, Geryon. We have packing to take care of. Geryon, a little awed by the solemnity of the discussions, rose quietly and followed her to the door. Chapter 20. King Anheg's study was a large, cluttered room high in a square tower. Books bound in heavy leather lay everywhere, and strange devices with gears and pulleys and tiny brass chains sat on tables and stands. Intricately drawn maps with beautiful illuminations were pinned up on the walls, and the floor was littered with scraps. I would not be surprised, Aunt Paul said. He is much more clever than he looks, you know. You are walking very close to the edge of treason. You ought to have a few babies. They would give you something useful to do with your time, and keep you out of trouble. That's only a suggestion, of course, but you might think it over. I've enjoyed our visit, dear. Thank you for your hospitality. And with that, she turned and walked away. Silk whistled softly. That explains a few things. Explains what? Garion asked. The High Priest of Balar's been dabbling in Cherek politics lately. He has obviously gone a bit further than I'd thought in penetrating the palace. The Queen? Garion asked, startled. Eileen is obsessed with the idea of magic. The bear cultists dabble in certain kinds of rituals that might look sort of mystical to someone as gullible as she is. He looked quickly toward where King Rodar was speaking with other kings and Mr. Wolf. Then he drew in a deep breath. Let's go talk to Porin, he said, and led the way across the wharf to where the tiny blonde queen of Drasnia stood looking out at the icy sea. Highness, Silk said deferentially. Dear Keldar, she said, smiling at him. Could you give Sir with the details not to be involved in this plot? As if he had realized himself that he had gone too far, Lotharin stared at Garion with consternation. Oh, I am a fool, he blurted, with a guilty look around him. I've never learned to control my tongue. Please, forget what I just said, Garion. I know you are my friend, and I know you won't betray what I said in a moment of heat. That was one thing Garion had feared. With that single statement, Lotharin had effectively sealed his lips. He knew that Mr. Wolf should be warned that some wild scheme was afoot, but Lotharin's declaration of friendship and trust had made it impossible for him to speak. He wanted to grind his teeth with frustration as he stared full in the face of a major moral dilemma. They walked on, neither of them speaking, and both a little embarrassed, until they reached the bit of a wall where Garion had waited in ambush the day before. For a time, they stared out into the fog, their strained silence growing more uncomfortable by the moment. "Oh, what is it like in Sandaria?" Lotharin asked suddenly. "I have never been there." "There aren't so many trees," Garion answered, looking over the wall at the dark trunks marching off in the fog. "It's an orderly kind of place. But did you live there?" At Faldor's, well, not a serf, certainly. Lotharin sounded shocked. "There aren't any serfs in Sandaria." "No serfs?" The young Aaron stared at him uncomprehendingly. "No," Garion said firmly. "We've never found it necessary to have serfs." Lotharin's expression clearly showed that he was baffled by the notion. Garion remembered the voices that had come to him out of the fog the day before, but he resisted the urge to say something about serfdom. Lotharin would never understand, and the two of them were very close to friendship. Garion felt that he needed a friend just now, and he did not want to spoil things by saying something that would offend this likable young man. "What sort of work does your father do?" Lotharin asked politely. "He's dead. So is my mother." Garion found that if he said it quickly, it did not hurt so much. Lotharin's eyes filled in sudden, impulsive sympathy. He put his hand consolingly on Garion's shoulder. "Oh, I'm sorry," his voice almost breaking. "It must have been a terrible loss." "I was a baby," Garion shrugged, trying to sound offhanded about it. "I don't even remember them." It was still too personal to talk about. "Some pestilence?"
The oil. I don't know how.
If he can show Torak how it's done, no power on earth will be able to stop One Eye from becoming king and god over the whole world. They all sat in the ruddy, flickering light of the fire, their faces serious as they considered that possibility. "I think that pretty well covers everything, don't you, Paul?" "I believe so, Father," she replied, smoothing the front of her gray homespun gown. Later, outside the tower, as gray evening crept in among the foggy ruins of Voachun, and the smell of the thick stew Aunt Paul was cooking for supper drifted out to them, Garion turned to Silk. Is it all really true? The small man looked out into the fog. Let's act as if we believed that it is, he suggested. Under the circumstances, I think it would be a bad idea to make a mistake. Are you afraid to leave it? You'll be my sister instead, traveling with me to see the splendors of Tolhanath. Your sister? Oh, well, you could be my mother instead if you prefer, Silk suggested blandly. Making a religious pilgrimage to Marterin to atone for a colorful past. And Paul gazed steadily at the small man for a moment, while he grinned impudently at her. Someday, your sense of humor is going to get you into a great deal of trouble, Prince Kaldar. Oh, I'm always in trouble, Lady Polgara. I would not know how to act if I were not.
Do you two suppose we could get started? Mr. Wolf asked.
Oh, just a moment more. If we meet anyone and have to explain things, you, Leldarin, and Garrion are Polgara's servants. Hetar, Beric, and his uncle, the king of Drasnia, Garrion explained. From what I understand, the Drasnians have been at this sort of thing for centuries. We've got to stop and pick up the rest of the packs, Silk was reminding Mr. Wolf.
I have not forgotten.
Shadows hovering in the trees around them. I have an uncle who lives not far from here, Leldarin offered. Count Reldigan. I am sure that he will be glad to give us shelter.
Then, Mr. Wolf asked. Dark hair.
It is grey now, Leldarin replied. Do you know him?
I have not seen him for 20 years, Wolf told him. As I recall, he used to be quite a hothead.
Uncle Reldigan? You must have him confused with somebody else, Belgara.
Maybe. How far is it to his house?
No more than a league and a half away.
Let's go see him then, Wolf decided.
Leldarin shook his reins and moved into the lead to show them the way. How are you and your friend Gillian? Silk asked, falling in beside Jerry. Fine, I suppose, Girion replied, not quite sure how the rat-faced little man intended the question. It seems to be a little hard to explain things to him, though. That is only natural. He is an errand, after all. His defense. He's honest and very brave. Yes, they all are. And that is part of the problem. I like him. Oh, so do I, Gillian. But that does not keep me from realizing the truth about him. If you're trying to say something, why don't you just go ahead and say it? All right, I will. Do not let friendship get the better of your good sense about the house. A grim solidity that seemed to defy the world. It's not a very pleasant-looking sort of place, is it? He said to Silk. Asturian architecture is a reflection of their society. A strong house isn't a bad idea in a country where neighborhood disputes sometimes get out of hand. Are they also afraid of each other? Just cautious in your house? Bathing in winter is dangerous, Lady Polgara, the Count warned her. My lord, she stated gravely, I have been bathing winter or summer for more years than you could possibly imagine.
Let her bathe, Rowdigan, Mr. Wolf urged. Her temper deteriorates quite noticeably when she thinks